Welcome to the podcast, everybody.
Hey, Steph. How you
Hey.
doing?
Oh, you know,
I know. I know. I know.
I'm actually doing pretty good. I'm
Yeah.
I'm so excited because the sun is out longer and then there's the blue skies.
Well, I don't know about when this podcast comes out,
That's
but here in
true.
the UK, it is grey and rainy down in south and snowing in the north. We finally got
Oh,
some snow, but nowhere near me.
all right. So what are we here for?
We are here to talk about healthy eating gone too far, aka orthorexia. Is that, do you think, where we're going with this conversation?
I think it's going to be absolutely a part of it. I also feel like potentially we might have listeners on this episode that haven't previously listened to us. Do you think?
That's very optimistic. Why not? Hello, new listeners.
Hello, new listeners. Just because I think this topic is one that sometimes we don't know we're looking for until we find it. And so if there's something in the topic that feels relevant as far as like I'm somebody who's invested in healthy eating, I'm not thinking about not dieting. Like that's not part of anything I'm conceptually aware of. But yes, I do have this sense that my healthy eating feels a little bit disordered. That this might be a gateway conversation into what we talk about outside of this topic, which is, the issues with dieting and the issues with restriction, which maybe you wouldn't consider it as, but the issues with having parameters around what it is that we're eating and the morality of that.
I think that's a good point because many people, I think, who pursue healthy eating would say, I'm not dieting. So this
Yeah.
non-diet message doesn't mean anything to me. I'm just trying to eat healthily. And that's what I'm supposed to do. That's about health. So you can't tell me that that's not a good thing to do.
Exactly. And even as I had an obsession with clean eating and healthy eating, at that time, I actually thought that I was, well, not entirely, but I thought that I was no longer really disordered, especially for the length of time when it was working, quote
Mm.
unquote. I thought that I had just like sort of evolved beyond my eating issues to have finally arrived in this place where processed foods are no longer polluting my gut and brain. And I'd made it, and that this was really the recovery path. And it ended up becoming just another version of disorder for me. So maybe we should just back up though and talk about, well, we were going to define orthorexia.
Are you buying time while you're quickly Googling it?
No, I Googled it. I was
Okay.
just wondering if we should go straight there. Okay. So orthorexia may be a term that some of us aren't familiar with. It is an obsession with eating healthy food.
Well, what's wrong with that? If it's healthy food and it makes us healthy, what's the problem, Stephanie?
Obsession. Obsession. I think there is a difference between choice, choosing foods that have nutritional merit versus being obsessed with said choices. And that is where I think people might be Googling this topic or searching for it in YouTube or on the podcasts and resonating with something about like, yeah, there is something a little bit fishy about the way this all feels. There's something a little bit more than it's like there's something going on here. Because when you're obsessed with something, it starts to take over. It doesn't feel like you're making choices. It feels like you're compulsive about those choices, and that it starts to drag you around and become an issue where if you're not eating certain things that you're getting upset about it and feeling like you're doing something wrong, and then trying to compensate for that or trying to rationalize that, or even it affecting your mood in a really significant way. At that point, I think where we've crossed over from basic nutritional wisdom into something on the disordered spectrum.
Can you tell us about your tipping point then? Because I know some of our listeners will, some might not, that to begin with, it was restriction, pretty much anorexic behaviors. Then that went into binge eating. And then there was a tipping point into this healthy eating or this move into this way. And I know there was still some binging within that, but it sounds like there was a bit of a switch. And what happened? What happened for you there? Because I tell you what, when I was in my binge eating, I would have given anything to have been orthorexic. I'd have been like, yeah, I want to be obsessed with eating the healthy food. I couldn't see the problem. I thought that was the goal. I wouldn't have used the word obsessed, but the goal was to become some kind of clean eater who was like in charge.
Yeah. Well, because it's very marketed. It's like Gwyneth Paltrow. It's on a pedestal, right? That sort of lifestyle, and it's that's not why I pursued it. I mean, that's not what got me into it, but it certainly felt like that to me too. Like this was the goal and it was a good thing. What got me into it was actually, well, on the outside, it was having kids. because once I had my first daughter, which is now about 13 years ago, I wanted to make her baby food. And I was starting to read about making baby food, which was going alongside of, wealthy stay-at-home moms were blogging about that. And wealthy stay-at-home moms were also buying into this, like, well, actually, what we want to feed our children is so important, but also what we're feeding ourselves. And it was just, the worlds kind of went together. So as I was learning about how to feed my child and how, processed foods for them are so bad, it was a really quick slide into, well, what about what I'm feeding myself? And the more that, I also was fully invested in making food for my child. I had the time to do it. I wasn't working at first, and it was fun. But that was also like, oh, I got in the kitchen more, and cooking became part of something that I liked to do and I was enjoying doing for her. So then I started doing it for me, and then I started doing it for my husband and I. And then it quickly became an obsession the more I was learning about all of this stuff. But I say that was on the surface because I attached to that really quickly. And the reason why is because I was looking for something to attach to all the time because I still had an eating disorder. So I've worked with different people who have kind of become disordered through the pursuit of healthy eating. But I've also worked with people, and this would be more representative of myself, where there was already a pre-existing disorder of some kind, and maybe not even just about food, where healthy eating became the thing that we attached to, and that became the new face of the disorder. Let's talk about the pursuit of healthy eating and how that looks without disorder and how that looks within disorder and why we should be looking at that anyway. Because I guess you could even argue, what's wrong with being obsessed with healthy eating? It's good for you. How is that actually a bad thing? It's like being obsessed with kindness.
I might think about it is the mind healthy around food? So when I think about my pursuits, were always very short-lived. I would try the whole low carb eating quite often, but I also had it in my head that whole foods was the answer. As long as I was eating what I would have labeled whole foods or natural foods, then I should be okay. Because when I binged and when I binged hard, it was never on those foods. So therefore, of course, it makes sense because I'm not restricting here because I'm saying I can eat as much as I want or as much as I feel like I need. And it's going to give me a healthy body and it's going to stop me from binging. It seemed like it just made the most sense. The problem was of course that when I was trying to do this, there was such a resistance in me to placing that kind of what felt like a cage around me. To begin with, when I first decided, okay, right, no, I'm going to focus. I'm not going to eat these foods anymore. It felt hopeful. It felt like the promise of fixing myself. And then all it took was a difficult moment, a low mood, a hangover, something that would in me ignite a craving for another kind of food, for food that didn't fit into the kind of foods that I thought I had. The problem would be is then I would feel that resistance to the craving itself. And there's a battle beginning in me. And the battle just it wouldn't end until I actually ate the food. And then when I ate the food, I felt like I had completely blown it, completely failed. Last supper eating would kick in. It's like, okay, well, tomorrow I'll get back on it with eating only the healthy foods. And I would just eat as much as I could. I would actually want to make myself feel ill. I would want to feel so sick and sugared out and fed up of these foods that by the end of the evening, I'd think, oh, I just never want to see these foods again. Because I somehow thought that I could carry that mindset
like
through,
negative,
but it doesn't work like that.
Negative,
like a negative reinforcement, or aversion therapy, that kind of thing. It didn't work for me, and I don't see it working for others either.
Well, actually, I want to speak to that. But what you're saying is essentially like it sets up a black and white mindset. And that's what I mean. I think that if you already have that, if you have a vulnerability to black and white mindset or perfectionism, this is going to nestle into that part of your mind most likely. And it becomes very easy then for it to become disordered because this is a perfect place to reenact perfectionism and black and white thinking. So I don't think that, and I want to be clear on this because this is something that I think in the and if you look back to episode, what's the anti-diet episode?
I feel like it's 111, maybe.
I don't know. What the hell? You're right.
Am I really?
Yes. How? I don't know.
Can we
Like,
leave
how
that
you-
in?
Yeah.
Because do you know what? I love that episode. I love the episode 111 we did on the
Uh,
anti-diet identity. And I remember seeing the number, the 111, and being
oh,
like, that was such a good episode. And the triple number, just all
oh,
of it was
okay.
very
So
pleasing
you
to
make
me.
the
That's why I
thumbnails.
remembered.
Okay.
If I'm honest.
All right. All right. Thought you had some kind of like list in your mind of all the things you've ever done. That episode speaks about how when we're sort of rejecting these ideas and really how black and white thinking and perfectionism and diet culture and clean eating and these types of things have contributed to our disorders, and we're rejecting those things, there is also a tendency to over reject certain elements of that and then become very staunch in the resistance of that. And I want to clarify that I do not believe that, let me put it this way. I do believe that nutrition can be really helpful in making us feel better sometimes. And that certain people more than others too. I have noticed with clients, like there's some people who really, yeah, like there's more of an impact with certain kinds of foods in the body than with others. That's very distinct. But I don't believe that we need to be rejecting the idea of basic nutritional wisdoms. And in the intuitive eating book, this is discussed. I've also mentioned that when Evelyn Tribole and Elise Resch, the authors of intuitive eating, mentioned that basic nutritional wisdom was a part of intuitive eating, I remember being surprised because in my mind at the time, I was such a staunch anti-dieter. But there is room for nutrition, and there's room for nutritional awareness, and there's room for choices that are rooted in some part based on nutrition. There's room for that. But it's this obsession and over moralization and over attachment to that pursuit that is the problem and can quickly become the problem. And we've got a culture who are standing by, like applauding all of that and reinforcing all of that to such degrees that the disorder feels like the right thing. And I think this point of this podcast episode is to call into question, like, have we crossed over into a line that's being validated all the time and is actually creating issues inside of you or creating a problem that is creating suffering, essentially? And can that be because of this over attachment to healthy eating and what circumstances that creates in our minds? And then we also, I think, should speak to the restriction angle of that and what that does for binge eaters and bulimics, because also I will say that part of what I ended up doing was my bulimic behavior started to resurface too, because I felt contaminated if I had something outside of the clean eating scope.
But do you think it's possible to have an identity whereby you are identified with a particular way of eating? It feels like your identity. Say it's what we think of as healthy eating or clean eating. Can that come from a healthy place in someone?
To be identified with it?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, like, is it healthy to be identified with things? Therapist Sarah?
Is it possible to live without being identified to things?
Touche. I'm going to put it this way. I think there are people for whom it works, quote unquote, who make it kind of work for themselves. What episode is that? Where we talk about why dieting works for some people. In episodes 55, which is, but why can some people diet and I can't? And also I think it shows up a little bit in episode 108, but it's not fair. And by the way, those aren't rolling off the top of my head. I had to look them up. I don't know if Sarah, if you probably knew them, but
I did. I didn't want to show off because 55 was another repeated number. So I know all those.
You did know it?
No, I didn't.
Kidding.
No.
Oh. But there is a discussion to be had around, like, there are people who can do that and I say can, not like it's like, oh, aren't they so great? I say it like there's some people who have a more rigid mindset and less rebel tendencies, which again is further discussed in those episodes, but it can work, quote unquote, enough for someone. And I think that, is it a good thing? I think insofar as we need those identities sometimes to cope with life or with our, to make us feel safe. Yeah, it can work to serve a purpose until that starts to feel like, and this is, I think, where people start to enter non-diet realms, is where that suddenly the cost benefit analysis on that becomes a little skewed, and or we feel more ready to shed protective layers and to sort of, just become different. I don't know how to say that, like become different versions of ourselves, or or explore things that have previously felt too scary to explore, I think the identity can serve a purpose and serve a function.
This is going to be very tangential, but when you were saying safe, I realized when you said that, oh, that's how I use the word peace. Remember early on how we spoke about peace, and you felt like peace kind of had an opposite swing to it, whereas safe doesn't necessarily have an opposite swing to it. It's not because you're safe that's going to trigger feeling unsafe again. You will feel unsafe again because we move in and out of things. But it made me think of that.
Yeah. So we all listeners, I would be so excited to hear how we all think about that term, the way that I talk about it through the lens of safety. You talk about it through the lens of peace. What would be the opposite for you?
Disturbance.
Like the conflict?
Agitation, not disturbance. Agitation would be the word. I'm agitated.
Yeah. I'm talking about it though, in this context, like safety of not just in an acute moment, but safety of holding together who we think we are and how we need to be in order to have peace in general, like more of a generalized sense of that. Maybe that is what you meant as well.
Well, this is where it gets tricky, isn't it? Because there will be people who feel obsessed with healthy eating who might come under the orthorexia umbrella. And there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear around food, but they'll say, I feel safer when I'm eating these foods and I have safe foods. Like it's still this drive towards safety. But they're recognizing that part of this drive is making them feel unsafe as well. Like it's only working when they feel like they managed to get it right, and very temporarily. For those people, I guess I'm wondering how you would speak to that in terms of creating a safety outside of that. How do you find safety somewhere else when you have been seeking safety for so long in like food quality or purity or however you're thinking about it?
Okay, well, the first thing that comes to mind is this. Part of the reason why I would have said I don't feel safe eating outside of that bracket is because I would have become out of control, right? So that feeling of being out of control with food is the opposite of feeling safe with it. So it would have triggered something in me that would have opened up Pandora's box, and then I would have become the shadow side of myself, which is messy and impulsive and can't control myself and like just completely a mess. But yes, that will happen if you are restricting. You know what I mean? And that's why restriction is part of the conversation, because let's not forget that there's many people who are in pursuit of healthy eating who are also restricting their calories or their carbs. You know what I mean? These things often go hand in hand. And so if you are restricting and you are suppressing your body weight through healthy eating, when you break the rules and you go into the other side of things, your body will respond with fury, and I'll speak for myself to make it more concrete. So when I would drink sometimes, I would go out and have alcohol and want, the food my friends were having. They would, processed food, and I would have it because I was drinking, and everything would unravel from there. And then the next day I would be a mess, and all my cravings would open up, and it was last supper eating, as you mentioned. And that's why I would say, see, it's not safe for me to eat those processed foods. They ignite all my cravings. I'm addicted then. Once I have some, I need it all. And we're interpreting that through a lens of, see, like proof. When in fact, the reason that was happening was because I was a black and white thinker, and because my body was sort of saying, oh, we're allowed to eat right now. Go for it. Go for it. Go for it. Because we normally restrict. So it's not a product of the food creating that. It's a product of the mindset creating that, and the physiology of not having enough food anyway, and the psychology of it. Once I worked through that stuff, I could be around clean eating foods, quote unquote, and not, and everything remains neutral. I don't become out of control. So this is also part of that addiction theory stuff. You have to go through a pretty long process of being a little bit out of control with food to get to a place of neutrality. So not many people are doing that. So it's easier to interpret it through a lens of addiction.
At what point then do you feel that moment or that realization where you accept that in order to get through this, to heal, to feel better around food, means a food freedom approach, means having all these processed foods, for want of a better word? Like that moment where you become convinced, or convinced enough to be willing to try it. Like you're going against this belief system you've clung to for so long. I'm curious about that, and I appreciate it may not be like one boom moment, but that dawning realization.
Yeah. Okay, so one was I couldn't go anywhere. I had to bring my own food places to the extent that it was really inconvenient and sometimes awkward. I've got clients who said, I would bring coolers with me to restaurants or to parties where an allergy doesn't exist. You know what I mean? And where it's just becoming like a choice that's, yeah. So this was one people, my mom was calling me out on it too. My mom was saying, Stefanie, you're like, she was pointing out the ways in which I was being very rigid. And she was always good at that. She's like,
and you were like, yes, you're right, Mom. I'll change. Is that what happened?
No, I thought she was, the thing is, and this is where the morality comes. I was like, you just don't know. You just aren't educated enough in this, which the thing is, my parents don't care about that stuff. So anybody who would argue with me on it, I would interpret their lack of caring as like lack of intelligence around it. And that's different than understanding that what my mom was talking about wasn't about like lack of knowledge, because if she did end up learning a lot about it because I would tell her everything, but she just still didn't care because she just was more, my mom's more moderate. Like my mom just understands balance in a way that I never did naturally. So she eats things that would come under the cleaning umbrella because she enjoys them, but she doesn't identify with it. And she also doesn't want to she doesn't need an identity like that. So sometimes I think looking towards people who have more of that balanced approach and the differences, like that's where I started to notice. And there were other friends of mine who, when I would go out to dinner with them, I'm like, those people who you're like, you just are a balanced lady. Like you just have a real down to earthness about you. And those people, I just started to compare what was going on and be like, I am not like that. I'm not able to just flexibly enjoy something or spontaneously, or not even just to be okay, to be calm about food in that way. How nice that looks. Like, and then how you have that gut sense of that's what peace is. That's what safety is what they have. It isn't this, because I am furiously chasing peace and safety and I am not getting there. Like you can feel it. You feel like that out of control. So you feel like you're always on a tightrope. And that somewhere inside. And I think that it's that sense becoming bigger and bigger. And perhaps even reading an article or listening to a podcast that starts to talk about it and you feel the resonance. That was happening too, where I think I read an article in Time magazine about this and it rang so true. But I also was like, no, like close the magazine. Don't read that, because it was threatening what I was relying on. But it did plant a seed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, who knew that furiously chasing peace wouldn't take you there, right?
I love that. The oxymoron of it all. I think it's helpful though to talk about how does nutrition play a role in our life in a balanced way, because maybe that's less talked about. I think there's a lot of anti-diet stuff talking about what orthorexia is and how unhealthy the obsession is, and that's all true and valid and absolutely worth exploring. But also then what? Like what does it look like to have a healthy relationship with nutrition? And is it possible if you've had disordered eating or if you tend to be black and white about things?
Let me share what I said on one of my reels where I spoke about food neutrality, the carrot and the carrot cupcake one.
Yes.
So the idea is I don't feel exactly the same about carrots as I do about cupcakes. Carrots is something I'm going to go to if I have a roast dinner, if I'm having a hot meal, or maybe if I'm having a salad, I'm going to want some carrot in that. And if I want a treat or some fun foods, or I just want to eat something because it tastes good, then I'm likely to go for the cupcake. The difference in terms of when something is disordered and when something is healthy is that whether I choose the cupcake or whether I choose the carrot, I feel the same about myself, even if I don't feel the same about those foods, because cupcakes are always going to be more delicious to me in some ways, but carrots are absolutely going to have their place and I want them in my life as well. They're a vegetable that I enjoy. I think when it comes to gentle nutrition and trying to introduce a bit more than that, I always start with people with adding in, not taking away. I think when you get into the substitution place where you're saying, okay, I am not going to have a cupcake, I'm going to have a few carrots for my dessert because carrots are sweet after all, right? There's the morality, I think, is a big part of it, and we've touched on that already, this idea that foods are better, there is an element of, for me, how I might think of it is, what do I want my food to give me? So I know that my meals, on the whole, and this is the flexibility part, on the whole, I want my meals to be what I would think of as substantial foods. When I'm planning meals or deciding what I'm going to have, there is a thought to, I would like some vegetables in that. I would like some protein, I would like some fat, and I would like some fiber. It's not as listy as that, but I'm very aware of like a variety and a combination of foods that's going to be satisfying to
Carbs
me.
too?
Didn't I say that?
No, that's why I wanted.
Oh, I said vegetables, didn't I? That was a slip.
I knew what you meant, but
Absolutely.
I think people are
No,
listening,
thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I spoke previously, actually, I think in some of our early podcasts, about one of my meals I used to have a lot was salmon and a whole load of steamed vegetables. And I thought that was really satisfying at the time.
Huh.
And it wasn't until I added some potato in, I was like, oh no, this is what satisfaction really feels like. That kind of solid combination. And I have the flexibility that if I want to go out for a meal, or let's say I want to have a pizza for dinner, which isn't going to be particularly high in protein, that is absolutely part of it. To get there, I think it takes some time. And for me, it took so much reassurance and also so much experimenting, because once I'd had the lived experience of, oh, I feel more satisfied when I have my meals are combinations like this. And I know that I need to feel free, and I know I want variety, and I know I want food that is just delicious to eat. And I want to know that I can join in with any sort of social occasion where food might be around. That I think it does take time. And it takes that noticing of your reactions, because if you've struggled with disordered eating, there's going to be part of your brain that is going to freak out at any thought or hint that you're getting it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And it's coming back to like, what are the principles? And for me, it was always, okay, eat regularly, try to feel satisfied. I really want to feel free. The most important thing to me was making my choices feel like choices. But I noticed that if I didn't give any thought to my meals, I could fall into grabbing stuff on the go a lot. And that would tend to be more processed foods. And that I found that when I ate more processed foods, because I wasn't giving any thought to my meals, then I found that my appetite just felt more variable, felt a bit more chaotic and a bit more up and down. But I guess it started to feel more intuitive through the actual bodily experience of eating like this, seeing what happens, feeling wobbly with food, and then reflecting, going like, why do I feel so out of balance with food? What's going to help me feel more balanced again? And bringing my attention back to that.
When we're talking about how to handle or what to do, there's almost a different pathway depending on where you're coming from it. Like I came from a binge restrict place. So I think if you are a binge restrictor, if you are binging and restricting, even if you're not calling it restriction, I don't know, because what you're talking about is gentle nutrition. And I don't know that you can just go there. I don't think so. I don't think you can just go to gentle nutrition. I think you have to do the whole recovery thing first and really giving time to allowing all foods in a way where you're not really thinking about nutrition. And then there's room for that, which, by the way, I'm running a course beginning in April. Gentle nutrition is for people who have done that work and are now ready to reintegrate and think about gentle nutrition, which can be very scary because sometimes it feels like, am I restricting if I think about nutrition? Like once you understand restriction, it starts to feel like, oh, is that because that's what it was before. And reestablishing a relationship with nutrition. But I also think there's people who may not be in a place of overly restricting, right? I think you have to deconstruct and understand restriction. Absolutely, some kind of understanding of it. But I think you can kind of go into gentle nutrition sooner and faster.
So when you were saying you could come out of this binge restrict place, so when you decided to let go of the pursuit of weight loss or controlling your body, the reflex to that meant eating more. Like that was just where it went, where it happened. Whereas at that point, for me, I was in a much more permissive place with food. So anytime I was saying to myself, okay, you're not focusing on weight loss, immediately I started eating less because I was stuck in this Last Supper eating cycle. That was the big one for me, that and some kind of more generalized numbing with food at times. But the problem would be is the minute that I stopped pursuing the weight loss, and that's okay, I'm not trying to lose weight, I would end up eating less. And then then I would notice I was eating less, and then I would start overthinking that. And then anytime I ate a bit more, felt a little bit out of control, I was judging and then going back into trying to control a bit. I never felt like I was doing this extreme control. And this was why I couldn't understand why the reaction to it just kept going and seemed as big as it was. But I don't think in the beginning, certainly not in the beginning, that I was particularly thinking about, I don't know, because I was going to say that I wasn't particularly thinking about nutrition, but I think I probably was always thinking about nutrition.
Is anyone not? You know what I mean? Because
Yeah.
I think that it's something that's so, again, it's very talked about. It's a cultural obsession too. And it has its place. It really does. But it's just, I think it's just so pushed. It's just so pushed. It almost sounds simple when I think about it. It's like, it comes down to something very simple. It's like nutrition's not that hard when it's coming from the moderate place, but it's so hard to be in a moderate place about it. I also think it's worth talking about the way that we hear a lot of experts talking about the real danger of certain foods. And I just want to always be calling into question. There is no one way of eating that is like nutritionally the best. There's all different versions of that. For example, you will have experts and doctors and PhDs and talking about how, veganism is absolutely the best way to find health. And here's all the reasons why. And here's all the people who die who don't do it. And you will find the experts and PhDs and MDs talking about keto and how having high protein and low carb, which is not going to happen on a vegan diet, is going to be there isn't an agreement on this. So that means you can't listen to any one person because there's too many variables and there isn't one way of thinking about it. And also so many of the people that I followed when I was obsessed with clean eating and all the other kinds of eating were very disordered. And not to mistake that, like eating disorders and disordered eating and diet culture is definitely infiltrated. It is woven into very high places. It is in medical. It is in medicine. It's everywhere. And I just feel like sometimes I look back and I listen to all the people that I just was like, look, this guy knows exactly what he is talking about. He is brilliant. And everything he says makes so much sense. And I now look back and I'm like, oh, and here's all the holes I could poke in that now. Just because also if you are binge eating, if you are somebody who is pursuing this and then you are finding yourself getting into these cycles of being completely out of control, that alone is an indicator that it's not working. And it's not because of you and your willpower. It has to do with more intricate processes that are getting ignored in the pursuit of this dogma. But how do you be more moderate? Like, how do you just tone it down? How do you not be identified with things if that's the where your brain goes?
Where my brain went with that question was, I think it starts with, I want to say self-compassion, because it certainly did for me with the self-talk. And I've spoken about this before. I started being a lot kinder to myself before my behaviors changed. I always thought, oh, if I just get my behavior under control, then I'll feel better about myself. For me, I had to do some inner stuff with that first, because the problem was what I ate. If it was going to dictate how I felt about myself, the consequence of that one food decision is then massive. So how can you be moderate about a food decision when you know the consequence of this decision is going to dictate how you feel about yourself? This was what it was for me anyway. So there was something a bit like the food neutrality example that I gave. It was recognizing these reactions that I had and going like, it's okay. And again, mentioned this before, I started seeing myself as lost more than weak-willed, undisciplined, out of control. I'm just lost and I'm really confused. And when I approached myself like that, even after I binged, as I would to someone who was lost and confused, there was a compassion in that. And then how I felt about myself, that catastrophization reduced. And then it helped to relieve some of the pressures, because when I was feeling an urge for something, whether I binged or not, did not feel like the end of the world. That didn't mean I didn't care that I was binging. I did, and I didn't want to be binging, but it didn't feel like the end of the world. So I could work through these feelings with less resistance and less like kind of, you can see what I'm doing with my body, as can the people on YouTube, but like I'm almost like want to null myself up, like I'm in this fight with myself about it. And that softened first. So that was where I think from a moderate perspective, the the first shift and wiggle room towards that was?
Trying to think about where mine was, and I feel like it's all very vague, like surrender and exhaustion, just recognizing the length. I think also seeing it as part of a disorder that was bigger than what it seemed to be, instead of thinking about it like as if it was just really about the food. I don't think I could have ever been moderate with nutrition if I hadn't recovered first. And when I say recovered, I mean worked on my mindset about things and about my self-acceptance and even about purpose in life. Like my only purpose at that time was my food. I spent a lot of time and energy. That's just what my life was a lot about. And so how can you be moderate about something that's your whole world, you know? So it was about changing the relation. It was about deconstructing a whole bunch of things. It's not something you could just like do. Yeah. But there's also, from a practical perspective, is more education. I think education, when I started to understand and read about alternate ways of thinking about this, that was helpful. Also, I'm a devil's advocate. So whenever I read anything or hear anything that's very extreme or thought-provoking even, I will Google its opposite. Like, just to be like, what do the critics have to say? I just think it's important to be not blindly accepting truths about things that are making claims that are going to like suppress your freedom. Make sure you know all about it before, and of course, I think actually maybe don't Google, because it'll take you down many rabbit holes, but just to maybe independently think about, does this sound true? Does it sound all the way true? Like, could there be other ways of thinking about that? Does it even feel true for me? Is it the case that if I have pizza sometimes, or if I have packaged food, in my home, that I'm going to like die an early death and suffer miserably for it? Because that's what they make it sound like.
Yeah. Well, if they're asking if it's really true, they can only find out that answer if they've died or not. But just to play devil's advocate to what you just said, what about somebody who said, well, I was keto for a couple of months and I felt great. So that is evidence to me that that is how my body should be eating.
My question right back would be like, well, why aren't you keto anymore? Because
yeah, go.
Yeah.
Go.
If we're then
because I'm big
Steph,
because I'm weak-willed, I had a moment where I broke, but if I can just get back on it and stay on it, everything will be fine.
Right. That comes up all the time. Or somebody will say, I had a major, like my mom passed away and I had emotional turbulence, and that's what got me off of it. Because that's really compelling evidence. It seems like, oh, that was an emotional thing, that created it. But what's even okay? And then I would also ask, like, what's difficult about getting back on it? If that was serving you well and you got sort of distracted from it, hop back on.
Because I'm an addict. I'm an addict, Steph. This subject, Steph, you and I go into in a much more depth in episode 83. But can abstaining from sugar and carbs help? We go a lot into the psychology of that, because we're not just talking about physiology when we're talking about adhering to a certain set of food rules or way of eating. There is a whole psychological element, and it's biopsychological as well, because our psychology affects our biology and our biochemistry. If you're someone and you're listening to this and you're going, I still think I'm the person that needs to cut it out. It's because I'm addicted. It's because my body reacts these ways to certain foods. You are absolutely allowed to come to that conclusion. My gentle encouragement is just to listen to episode 83 before you nail your colors to the mast.
Ooh, I never heard that term.
You don't have that term?
Maybe we do, but I don't know it. Nail your colors to the mast?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
It means to cement your opinion and go like,
no, I know, but what colors would be nailed to a mast? Where did that come from?
I thought it was to do with raising a flag, but I don't know what do people use to nail?
Just the whole thing.
Flags?
The whole thing is just confusing to me.
Before we invented string,
I don't know. Just nail those flags up.
Hang on a second. Let's. I'm gonna find out. Okay, I have just Googled it, and it is from the naval military practice of displaying one's colours, signal flags, or insignia from the mast of a ship during battle to show loyalty. So it's to do with declaring your opinions and your stance on something.
And it was nailed?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Maybe Americans didn't ever nail things. Maybe we had a different way of doing it. So we don't say that. To your point, different things make sense. Different things make different sense for different people. And if it's a struggle, if there is a reason that this podcast topic appealed to you because there's a sense of something not feeling quite aligned with the this should be direct. This should be a clear path right towards what makes us feel better. But if it doesn't feel so clear and there's stickiness, it isn't necessarily such a direct science. And that's all, folks. Today we are done.
This sounds so pleased.
Like, I have to go to the bathroom, and sometimes it's exciting to finish because I'm like, I think it's the coffee and the water I drink in the morning like this.
And to be fair, like your coffee or your water cup, is it water in there? Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, that water cup is like the size of your head. To be fair,
that's not. It is.
Pretty much is. Where
size your head too. Stop
no,
it.
but look at how narrow it is. Sorry, this is not really good for people on the podcast, but the YouTubers can enjoy it.
This is the thumbnail.
Yeah. I'm trying to push mine back further back because it looks smaller the further back it goes.
This is so small.
Look, see, look, it's so tiny.
Okay. All right. Well,
all right. Bye.
See you next time.
Love you. Bye.